Blessed are the ones who do not bury all the broken pieces of their heart. Blessed are the tears of all the weary, pouring like a sky of falling stars. Blessed are the wounded ones in mourning, brave enough to show the Lord their scars. Blessed are the hurts that are not hidden, open to the healing touch of God. The kingdom is yours. The kingdom is yours. Hold on a little more. This is not the end. Hope is in the Lord. Keep your eyes on Him.
Good morning. I hope that you all are enjoying and looking at the sunshine, the beauty of the sun and its warmth. Today, I'm going to be speaking to you. As with all of our services at Harvest House, we try to be as intentional as possible. And so today's message is going to come from me. And I hope that's okay. I asked Joel a few days ago if maybe I could take the service today to just talk with you. And in his kindness and his love for me and for this church, he said, absolutely. So here I am. Me teaching is not anything that's new. If you've been with us for any time, you know that I do this pretty regularly, actually. But today may be the toughest and most important message I've probably shared with you thus far. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you to do something for me. I am asking that you would come to the table and sit down. Now, that can be metaphorically. You can actually go to your table if you want, but to come to the table and to sit and let me talk with you. I think about those in our church that I've had the absolute pleasure to have meals with. The Speckens, I think about them, and we haven't had the pleasure to go to their new house yet because they moved during the pandemic, and with all of the coronavirus, we just obviously can't see each other right now. But I sat at their table at their old house many times and shared wonderful meals, one of which ended up with me in the hospital having to have emergency gallbladder surgery. But I do not hold that against them. And I think about, the Keens and the Carmichaels as we've gone to lunch after church and had such great fellowship. And I think about Gail Everson, who so beautifully and tenderly brought me into her family, allowed me to sit at her table as a teenager and share who I was. Over and over again, I can recall times at the table. The Taylors. I had the great fortune to host Grace's bridal shower last summer and to see their family and their love and to share a meal. So many times at the table. So I ask you to come now with me to the table. And if you don't know me, I ask that you allow me to join you at your table. As I form my thoughts for what I'd like to share today, there are a lot of trails I could follow to address the tension that we're going to speak about. I thought I could start with a poem or a quote or a story. I could speak about my feelings, my hurt, pain, outrage. I could share my unique journey of being a woman of color living in a predominantly white town. And I will say, I have stories of that. The more I thought about how I should begin this conversation today, the more ideas I came up with. And that's typical for me. I'm not an expert in diversity or inclusion, and I've not dedicated my life to the study of race. I will tell you today that I did come correct with much research and having been well read. I don't have all the answers, but here's what I do have and what my hope is for the outcome of me sharing today. And that's perspective. So perspective is where I'm going to begin. The way you see what is currently happening in our country will decide how you act or how you stay silent. We've talked a lot about that here in this church, and my God, I'm so thankful for that. The way you see. The conversation today will be hard for me and you. It will be uncomfortable. It will be challenging and require you to look at yourself, your beliefs, and your actions. It will be confrontational and quite likely unpopular. I'm okay with that. It will cause you to want to run away, to avoid, and to justify. So here is what I ask, that you stay with me. That you power through the hard stuff and the uncomfortable feelings. That you listen and that you hear. That you hear me through my experience versus your own reality or preconceptions. I'm going to say that again. My ask is that you hear me through my experiences versus your own reality or preconceptions. Just for this time, that's what I'm asking. This is extremely important. Not because I seek for you to be like me, but because I desperately need you to be you. And what does that mean? In who the Bible shows me that Jesus is, a brown-skinned, poor man whose entire message was dedicated to the tearing down of a system that was built to keep those in power and privilege in control, and the message of caring for the marginalized. That is the representation I so long for, what I want to see from those in the church. In this way, I need you as you to show up, to speak up, to act up, to be an ally for, at this moment, Black lives. And how do we begin this way of Jesus for this particular type of allyship? With looking at white fragility. So here we go. We're going to talk about it. Some of you may already be sighing, thinking, no, why do we have to talk about this? This is church. This isn't what we talk about here. And I disagree, and here's why. If the church is supposed to be a representation to the world of love and salvation and charity, then we must absolutely talk about these matters here. In fact, I would go as far as to say that every church today should be talking about George Floyd. This isn't just a matter for Black churches or churches that focus on social justice or churches that are in diverse neighborhoods. No, this is for church with the big C, all of us. As the hands and feet of Jesus, it is up to us to bring awareness and change to atrocities such as George Floyd. I will take a moment now to say this conversation is not going to be about debating or rebutting all lives matter and what about the white people being killed by police. No, I'm not going there today. Today is about us looking at how we are complicit to the racism in our country. I will say this only. If all lives matter and black on black crime are your immediate arguments or thoughts when I said George Floyd, you need to take a deep look at why this is. In 2011, Robin DiAngelo coined the term white fragility. She used it to describe the disbelieving defensiveness that white people exhibit when their ideas about race and racism are challenged, particularly when they feel implicated in white supremacy. Robin DiAngelo is a white woman, by the way. I dare say people use the defense of all lives matter, etc., because of this exact thing. It's what they're feeling. So let's see why this is and how we deal with it in a constructive and a helpful way. Our largely segregated society is set up to insulate whites from racial discomfort, so that it's easy to feel like you're falling to pieces at the first application of stress. That may be exactly what you're feeling right now, as you've seen the videos of George Floyd and the overwhelming outcry for racial justice over social media. Inside of your comfort and stability, you feel threatened by this. You say, this isn't my fault. I'm not a racist. I didn't do this. I don't see color. I can't deal with this. It's too much. The social cost for a black person in awakening white fragility often proves so high that many black people don't risk pointing out discrimination when they see it. And the expectation of white solidarity, white people will forbear from correcting each other's racial missteps to preserve the peace, which makes genuine allyship elusive. I'd say near impossible. White fragility holds racism in place. In the refusal to acknowledge your own participation in racist systems, you become part of the problem. These ideologies include hyper-individualism, the white American dream, the confidence that one can free oneself entirely from bias. We all have them. So the thought that you can be 100% completely unbiased from everything is just not reality. We have to look at ourselves again and again. To be perceived as an individual, to not be associated with anything negative because of your skin color is a privilege. Let me read that again. To be perceived as an individual, to not be associated with anything negative because of your skin color is a privilege. That is the privilege of white people in this country. Likewise, people of color often endure having their views attributed to their racial identities. The luxury of impartiality is denied to them. Addressing your privilege requires both humility and vigilance. And if Jesus taught us anything, he taught us humility and vigilance. At this point, we've moved from why we were talking about this at church. At this point, you've moved from why are we talking about this here in this space at church to, well, you've said all of this, but that's not me. I am not a racist. And if your definition of a racist is someone who holds conscious dislike of people because of race, then this is where we need to move to the topic of forms of racism. Racism occurs between individuals on an interpersonal level, and it's embedded in organizations and institutions through policies, procedures, and practices. Often it seems easier to recognize individual or interpersonal acts of racism, so that would be something like a slur, a person being ignored in a social setting because of their skin tone, an act of violence. However, individual racism is not created in a vacuum, but instead emerges from a society's foundational beliefs and ways of seeing and doing things, and is manifested in organizations, institutions, and systems. Individual racism refers to an individual's racist assumptions, beliefs, or behaviors, and is a form of racial discrimination that stems from conscious and unconscious personal prejudice. Individual racism is connected to, learned from broader socioeconomic histories and processes, and is supported and reinforced by systematic racism. Because of our culture of individualism, people often argue that their statements or actions are not racist because they're just my personal opinion. This individualism is a defensive reaction. It's how people can call a black person in a hoodie a thug or deem them a criminal or a threat, and will say they're not racist because it's just my opinion. Cultural racism refers to representations, messages, stories, conveying the idea that behaviors and values associated with white people or whiteness are automatically better or more normal than those associated with other racially defined groups. Cultural racism shows up in advertising, movies, history books, definitions of patriotism, and in policies and laws. Are you starting to see why this is a problem? It helps justify laws and policies such as racial profiling, an action by an authority based on the assumption that every person in a particular racial group is sufficiently likely to be a criminal that they can be stopped, searched, and or questioned. The fact of racial profiling thus creates the stereotype that people use to further justify the policy, so it just keeps going. Cultural racism is also a powerful force in maintaining systems of internalized supremacy and internalized racism. It does that by influencing collective beliefs about what constitutes appropriate behavior, what is seen as beautiful, and the value placed on various kinds of music, art, poetry, speech, and other forms of expression. All of these cultural norms and values in the United States have explicitly or implicitly racialized ideals and assumptions. For example, what nude means as a color. Nude for me is a different color than nude for Kelly. Which facial features and body types are considered beautiful? Which child rearing practices are considered appropriate? Systematic racism includes the policies and practices entrenched in established institutions, which result in the exclusion or promotion of designated groups. It differs from overt discrimination in that no individual intent is necessary and seeks to serve those privileged by the system. The very Constitution that governs our country is a prime example of this. The white males who wrote the Constitution cite that all men are created equal. Yet, this statement intentionally, openly excluded African Americans, indigenous people, and women. Do you see the irony? Systematic racism manifests itself in two ways: institutionally where racial discrimination that derives from individuals carrying out the dictates of others who are prejudiced or of a prejudiced society, and structurally, inequities or inequalities rooted in the system-wide operation of a society that excludes substantial numbers of members of particular groups from significant participation in major social institution. So look, I'm hoping that though you may feel like this is a lot of information, I'm an educator. That's what I do. If you don't know me, I work for DePauw University in the Study Abroad office, and one of my greatest thrills in life is getting to send kids away to other countries so that they can see how other people live and realize the humanity of us all. They come back changed, and they come back better people. I'm an educator, so I'm giving you all of this information because I feel like knowledge is power. So you're probably feeling like I've heard a lot of words, some of which I didn't know, some of which I don't like. But what I hope you're understanding and what you're defining is a framework for the reasons why a police officer of an organization that we, all of us, should be able to trust can so brazenly, outrageously watch a camera, watch him commit murder and do nothing to stop it. Even through the cries and the pleading of the man he was killing, through the screams from the crowd to stop, systemic racism allowed, more so I would say gave courage to, this man's individual racism to commit public murder. Here I share with you my contempt. How dare this person be able to take someone's life? Because being black or brown in America means you are dispensable, unvalued, and not worthy of respect. How dare you? And how dare we continue to allow these systems to go on? If you are in your feelings here about your whiteness, I'm calling it out. Humanity is calling you out and saying, stick around and deal with it. Let's work through it. Because people are literally being murdered as a result of us not dealing with it. Action. For the last couple of weeks, as more and more systemic racism is uncovered, I have personally asked my network of people to step up. So if you're friends with me on Facebook, or if we're friends and we see each other in real life or over the phone or through FaceTime or Zoom or Google Meet, because those are all the things that are happening right now, I've likely talked to you about, so what are you going to do? What action are you going to take? How are you going to be an ally? How are you going to help? Some have. Others have buried their head in the sand as if this isn't overwhelmingly hard for me to sit with, to deal with, to listen, to watch, to be afraid of. At this point, it is simply not enough for you to not be racist. You must be anti-racist. The I don't see color mantra that we often hear is not the goal. Carlos Rodriguez so clearly says it. I love the work that he does. He says it like this: I see your color and I honor you. I value your input. I will be educated about your lived experiences. I will work against the racism that harms you. You are beautiful. Tell me how to do better. That's the goal. If you say, I feel so bad that this is happening to Black people, then you must turn your empathy into action. Anti-racism is a practice. It's the active practice and process of identifying and eliminating systemic racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies, practices, attitudes, so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. Anti-racism is an active way of seeing and being in the world. Why? In order to transform it. I think about Jesus and I think about the absolutely beautiful life and example he shows us. All of it to transform. A person who practices anti-racism is someone who works to become aware of the following things. How racism affects the lived experience of people of color and indigenous people. How racism is systemic and has been part of many foundational aspects of society throughout history. If from the beginning this was baked in, we have a problem. Because our policy, our law, our justice system, law enforcement, everything's filtering through that. So that's big. This can be manifested in both individual attitudes and behaviors as well as formal policies and practices within institutions. Someone who practices anti-racism becomes aware of how white people participate, often unknowingly, in racism. And they understand the need to educate yourself without placing the burden on Black people to be your teachers. Being anti-racist is more action and behavior than identity or position, right? It's not something that you just say you are. It's something you do. It is, as Diane Flynn from Diversity Matters says, more indicative of a process of coming to a healthy and functioning sense of white racial identity. One of the functions and privileges of racism is that white people don't, as a whole, carry race as an identity. You get to be an individual. You get to be yourself. You get to be the norm. You get to be whole and not partial or hyphenated. I'm African American. My husband is just American. That's problematic for me. I was born here, just 8 months before him, in the same hospital. You don't have to make adjustments or modifications to know or name yourself. Having this conversation regarding white fragility and systemic racism may be leading you as a white person to feel guilty. That is, if you've made it this far with me, and I hope you have. Please have made it this far. Please be open to vulnerability. Let's talk about that guilt and what it can do. Guilt creates paralysis. Guilt transfers the responsibility to people of color. Guilt continues the aspect of racism wherein white people put people of color in a situation of taking care of them. By saying, I feel so guilty, I feel so bad, it puts the other person in a position of comforting. The other person is then silenced, must reposition or restate their truth, or worse, maintain their truth and risk being viewed as mean, insensitive, and angry. Unfortunately, guilt, if you do a little bit of the work, if you're open enough to do a little bit of the work and you feel that guilt, unfortunately, that's where most people get stuck. Guilt is the ultimate obstacle in the personal journey to becoming a white ally. And that's why we talk about guilt. We talk about it so you can move past it to do the work of allyship. I love what Austin Channing Brown says. Commitment to racial justice and anti-racism requires we dig into the muddiness of humanity, reckoning with the worst of our humanity as we call it out, and we call out its best. This work is not for the faint of heart. It requires hope, and not a hope founded on good feelings or good intentions, but hope that demands. For our hope is risky, relentless, rooted in our certainty that love will win. What an echoing of the hope of Martin Luther King Jr. And as Ibram Kendi, the author of How to Be Anti-Racist, says, to be anti-racist is a radical choice in the face of history, requiring a radical reorientation of our consciousness. To recognize privilege, to do some self-work in the midst of the culture that we live in is a radical decision. But we're asking you to make it. I'm nearing the end of my conversation. I pray that you've stayed the course, that you are pressing into Jesus in the midst of your self-examination. Jesus is the way. If you keep coming back to that, you're going to be all right. Jesus, who was murdered because he said, these systems must come down. We must do what is right for the communal good, not for the individual greed. Jesus, who was absolutely always on the side of the oppressed. I know this is why through slavery and Jim Crow and the civil rights movement and through countless atrocities at the hands of those in power, Black people continue to be resilient. Continue to give thanks. Continue to care for others. Continue to fight for equality, even though we are bone tired. I am exhausted. I'm exhausted that this keeps happening, that it ever happened. I'm exhausted for men of color who must fear for their life while doing the most mundane things like going out for a run. Exhausted that I have to battle inane excuses for racism. Exhausted that the focus of people of color being murdered can be so quickly sidestepped for riots and protests and outrage. You should be outraged. If this was directly affecting you, you absolutely would be outraged. When you constantly feel unheard, regardless of the ways you have tried to peacefully demonstrate the lack of equality in this country, the only language you have is riot. And for those of you who love to quote the delicate sayings of Dr. King without citing the complete context, that riot business I just said, that's his. America has failed to hear. It has failed to hear the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. It has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about injustice and humanity. All of that, that was Dr. King too. The oppressor will never agree to a right way to protest. I want to read you something by Glennon Doyle, who is a white woman. I've been reading her book Untamed, and it is wild and beautiful and so full of showing us how to unlearn the boxes we were put in as women when we were just little girls. And Glennon has a section in her book about racism, and she talks about a story with her children. She's talking to her girls about an atrocity that's happened, and they start talking about different things, and she brings out some books, and they read some different things by civil rights leaders, and they're looking at pictures, and one of her children sees in one of the marches a white woman up front in the march and says, hey, Mom, would that have been us? Would we have been there too? And she says, as I go to open my mouth to say, absolutely, we would have been there. Her oldest daughter said, no, we're not there now. So I'd like to read this and maybe give a little bit of perspective to that. Glennon says, I imagine myself to be the kind of white person who would have stood with Dr. King because I respect him now. Close to 90% of white Americans approve of Dr. King today. Yet, while he was alive and demanding change, only about 30% approved of him. The same rate of white Americans who approve of Colin Kaepernick today. So if I want to know how I'd have felt about Dr. King back then, I can't ask myself how I feel about him now. No, instead I have to ask myself, how do I feel about Kaepernick now? If I want to know how I'd have felt about the Freedom Riders back then, I can't ask myself how I feel about them now. Instead, I have to ask myself, how do I feel about Black Lives Matter now? If I want to know how I'd have shown up in the last civil rights era, I have to ask myself, how am I showing up today? So I read that because there's a parallel. You have to realize that today what we see Dr. King and the nonviolence and all of the softness that we want to pull out was as radical and riotous and outrageous as it is now. I am tired. I'm tired of our breath being extinguished because you feel you have the power, the authority, the right to take it. I am tired of making excuses for why people are not speaking up and taking action. I am tired of being divided. I am tired of worrying. I am simply tired. Yet, as a nation, we are finally witnessing through video these injustices. And because of that, my tired takes a back seat, and the overwhelming, unstoppable need for change takes the driver's seat. And I ask you, will you help me? Will you be like Jesus and dismantle the systems that are giving you privilege? Will you provoke these systemic enemies and side with those at the margins of power? Will you allow yourself to really see instead of seeing only what benefits you? Will you take the time to educate yourself? Will you allow yourself to let go of ideologies that serve to keep power in the hands of those that hate and oppress and murder? Will you defer to your Black brothers and sisters and let them show you the way? In closing, I ask you to take some time and give some space to recognize the role you play. And we're going to take communion, so if you would take a moment to get the elements, whatever elements you want to use for the bread and the cup. We're going to do that together. But look at the framework that is in place that supports the injustices we're seeing. I hope that today, if you know me, you know I have a heart for people. I love people. I love my community. I love being a part of a small town that shows up for one another. So I hope that everything I've said today, you've heard through love. And if you don't know me, I still hope you heard it through love. So I'm asking that in the way of Jesus, take action on behalf of your neighbor. Do you want to bless it?
So as we take communion together, Tosh asked that we could read the names of those whose lives have been taken in acts of brutality and murder against the Black community. And before we do that, I just want to bless the sacraments, and then I'm going to put up on the screen the names that we're going to be reading, and if you would feel led to listen or if you would feel led to speak. But if I can gently encourage you that until we name racism and until we name the victims of racism, it is allowed to be an ambiguous evil that we never have to own. So, God, we ask that you would bless this bread and this cup. We give you thanks. We give you thanks that on this Pentecost Sunday, a Sunday in which we celebrate in the church calendar diversity, where all people from all languages came together and your Spirit came upon them. They spoke in each other's language. I can't imagine a more fitting prophetic pronouncement of the need to see from another lens than to not speak in my own language, but to speak in the language of another. Help us to speak. Help us to listen. They heard one another in that way. And help us to embrace the fresh blowing of the wind that is overturning and upsetting systems and structures. As the text says, let the wind blow and let everything that needs to be shaken, and let what is true remain. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Let's take the bread. Let's take the cup together. We state these names in solidarity, in honor and in reverence to those whose lives were taken. George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Christian Cooper, Botham Jean, Tatiana Jefferson, Jonathan Farrell, Renisha McBride.
Stephon Clark, Jordan Edwards, Alton Sterling, Ayanna Jones, Mike Brown, Jordan Davis, Tamir Rice, the Charleston Nine.
Trayvon Martin, Sean Bell, Oscar Grant, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Corey Jones, John Crawford, Terrence Crutcher.
Keith Scott, Clifford Glover, Claude Reese, Randy Evans, Yvonne Smallwood, Amadou Diallo, Walter Scott, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray.
Is there anything else you'd like to say as we close? So as we close today, the last thing we're going to do is we're going to put up on the screen and let the live stream continue just for a moment with some resources. I love that Tosh mentioned that we do have a responsibility to educate ourselves. And in the same way that we have a responsibility to, as the scripture says, study to show yourself approved, we want to give of our time, of our talents, and of our treasure so that we can move to being an onlooker to the systemic racial injustice, to actually being an accomplice, one who is in full solidarity with. And so we're going to put on the screen a few resources. Those, I think there's 6 or 7 books. You can take a picture of that or write those down. These are books that we've read or have meant something to us in that way. And also, we're going to add on our church website page a tab that just simply says resources for anti-racism. On that tab, there'll be things like video clips, links to books, maybe links to articles of things that we can do to stand in solidarity with our African American brothers and sisters. And finally, if you're looking for something and your question is, what can I do? What can I do right now? Something physical. Maybe reading a book doesn't seem like enough. Join your local NAACP chapter. There is an NAACP branch here in Greencastle. I'm not sure where you're watching from. I know there probably is where you're at. Find that branch and join. And if you're white, if you look like me, don't join and speak. First join and listen. There are people of color, leaders who have been doing this for many years, and we have a lot to learn about how we can help. So join and listen, stand in the back, not in the front, and let's see what anti-racism can really look like.
And if I can leave you with one word of encouragement, I would say keep talking. So if you were hurt or offended or angered or any kind of emotion, take some time and then keep talking. We've got to get through this. We've got to work it out. So keep talking, keep having those conversations. We're going to continue to have these conversations because, as I said, this is a matter, social injustice overall is a matter for the church. So we will continue to have these conversations. Keep talking and try to have your guard down and your heart open as you enter those conversations. But keep talking. We love you. We appreciate our family, our church family. Thank you to those of you who have sent messages and, encouragement, things of that nature during this tough time. We appreciate it. Love you. Well, I probably pissed a bunch of people off.
Oh, I'll get over it. I've been so. I'm just so angry for the last couple of days, but sadly, that situation gets broken.
Blessed are the ones who do not bury all the broken pieces of their heart. Blessed are the tears of all the weary, pouring like a sky of falling stars. Blessed are the wounded ones in mourning, brave enough to show the Lord their scars. Blessed are the hurts that are not hidden, open to the healing touch of God. The kingdom is yours. The kingdom is yours. Hold on a little more. This is not the end. Hope is in the Lord. Keep your eyes on Him.
And blessed are the ones who walk in kindness, even in the face of great abuse. And blessed are the deeds that go unnoticed, serving with unguarded gratitude. And blessed are the ones who fight for justice, longing for the coming day of peace. Blessed is the soul that thirsts for righteousness, welcoming the last, the lost, the least.
The kingdom is yours. The kingdom is yours. Hold on a little more. This is not the end. Hope is in the Lord. Keep your eyes on Him. The kingdom is yours. suffer violence, and still have strength to love their enemies. Blessed is the faith of those who persevere, for though they fall